It was a hot summer when I first stumbled upon the old amphitheater, hidden deep within a dense, overgrown forest near my town. I had lived there my entire life, yet had never heard anyone speak of it. It was as if the place had been deliberately forgotten, swallowed by the wild. That sense of obscurity made it irresistible to me. I often went on hikes in those woods, searching for new trails or old relics of the past. But this place felt different. The air seemed cooler as I approached the clearing, as if the trees were whispering among themselves, discussing the trespasser in their midst. Vines and branches formed a natural barrier, and I had to push through, feeling thorns snag at my clothing, leaving small scratches on my arms. But the moment I broke through the last of the underbrush, I found myself standing in front of the ruins. The amphitheater lay sunken into the earth, its stone steps crumbling and half-buried beneath layers of moss and leaves. Tall trees bordered the edges like silent guardians, their branches intertwining above, casting shadows that made the place feel like it was in perpetual twilight. At its center, the stage jutted out, a flat slab of stone with strange carvings I couldn't decipher, weathered by time. I couldn't explain why, but the sight of it gave me a chill. It felt wrong, like a place that should have been left undiscovered. But curiosity got the better of me, and I descended the steps, careful not to lose my footing. The air grew thick with a strange scent, damp earth mixed with something metallic. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick played by the eerie atmosphere. When I reached the stage, I noticed the carvings more closely. Symbols, maybe runes of some sort, spiraled and twisted across the stone, forming patterns that seemed to blur if I stared at them too long. I knelt down and traced one of the grooves with my finger, the stone cool to the touch despite the heat of the day. As my fingertip followed the shape, a faint breeze swept through the amphitheater, causing the trees to sway and creak. A whispering sound drifted on that wind, so faint that I almost didn't hear it. But when it came again, it was clearer, a soft susurrus that seemed to emanate from the shadows themselves. I straightened up, my heart beating faster, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The forest seemed still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I left soon after, hurrying up the steps and back through the tangled undergrowth, my mind racing with questions about the place. Who built it and why had it been abandoned? Back home, I tried searching for any mention of an amphitheater in local history books or online archives, but there was nothing, not even a passing reference. It was as though the place didn't exist, except in the corners of my mind. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The whispers I'd heard, the strange carvings. There was something hauntingly beautiful about the mystery of it all. I told myself that I would go back, that I would uncover whatever secrets the amphitheater held. I had to know. But as sleep took hold, my curiosity twisted into something darker. I dreamt of the amphitheater bathed in moonlight, its stage stark and bare, the shadows around it stretching impossibly long. In my dream, I stood at the edge of the steps, looking down into that empty space. And from the darkness beyond the trees, figures emerged, silent, faceless forms that glided forward without a sound. They gathered around the stage, their heads tilted upwards as if listening. But there was no sound in the dream, only the suffocating silence that pressed against my ears. My dream self turned to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. The figures shifted, turning their gaze towards me, empty eyes that seemed to pierce through the dark. I woke up drenched in sweat, the memory of their eyes lingering in my mind like a shadow that wouldn't lift. And that whisper, just on the edge of hearing, still echoed in my head. I tried to shake off the unease, but a nagging feeling persisted, like I had touched something that was better left buried. The next day, I decided to return to the amphitheater. I told myself that I was being foolish, that it was just an old ruin with a strange atmosphere. But deep down, I knew it wasn't true. Something had changed since my first visit, something that now felt like it was waiting for me. When I returned to the amphitheater, the sun was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, casting a dull gray light over everything. The forest seemed darker than before, more foreboding. As I made my way through the underbrush, I couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were somehow leaning closer, as if straining to listen to my every step. It took longer than I remembered to reach the clearing, but when I finally emerged, the sight of the amphitheater sent a shiver through me. It looked just as ancient and eerie as the first time, but there was something subtly different. Like the shadows were longer, the air heavier with that metallic scent. I told myself I was imagining things, but doubt gnawed at my mind. I descended the crumbling steps again, this time with more caution, my footsteps echoing faintly in the stillness. As I reached the stage, the carvings caught my eye again, their patterns twisting and spiraling across the stone. I knelt down to examine them, tracing the lines with my finger once more, feeling the grooves beneath my touch. This time, the whispering came almost immediately, low and indistinct, like the rustle of wind through leaves, except the air was perfectly still. I froze, trying to pinpoint the source, but it seemed to come from all around, seeping up from the stone itself. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper, though I hadn't intended it to sound so small. Silence answered me, thick and suffocating. I stood up, scanning the edge of the trees, half expecting to see those shadowy figures from my dream lurking just beyond the clearing. But there was nothing, only the oppressive quiet. Despite my fear, I felt a strange pull towards the center of the stage, as if an unseen hand was guiding me. I stepped closer, my heart hammering in my chest, until I stood directly over the largest carving, a spiral that seemed to twist endlessly into itself. Without thinking, I crouched down and pressed my hand flat against the center of the spiral. The stone was cold, colder than it should have been, and as I held my hand there, I felt a faint vibration, like the hum of something alive beneath the surface. A low murmur seeped into my ears, growing louder until it resolved into a voice, ancient and hoarse, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I jerked my hand away, stumbling backward, my breath coming in short gasps. The voice faded, but the air felt charged, like the atmosphere before a storm. I backed away from the stage, but as I did, my foot caught on a root and I fell hard, the back of my head striking one of the stone steps. Pain flared, bright and sharp, and my vision swam. As I lay there, dazed, I thought I saw movement. A figure at the edge of the clearing, barely more than a shadow against the trees. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, moving with a strange, jerking motion as it stepped closer to the amphitheater. I tried to sit up, to scramble to my feet, but my body wouldn't respond. My limbs felt heavy, like I was sinking into the earth itself. The figure moved with a dreamlike slowness, each step accompanied by a faint scraping sound. It stopped at the edge of the stage, its head turning slowly to face me. Though its features were hidden in shadow, I felt its gaze burn into me, a sensation like ice spreading through my veins. And then, just as suddenly, the figure vanished, dissolving into the shadows like mist in the morning sun. The weight that had pressed down on me lifted, and I gasped for breath, scrambling to my feet. I stumbled away from the stage, clutching the back of my head where I'd struck the stone, feeling the warm stickiness of blood on my fingers. I nearly fell again as I scrambled up the steps, my vision blurring from the pain and fear. The trees seemed to close in, branches clawing at me as I tore through the undergrowth, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever I had just seen, or thought I had seen. When I finally broke through the tree-line and stumbled onto the familiar path that led back to town, I collapsed, pressing my hands into the dirt to steady myself. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even here, with the sunlight filtering through the leaves and the sound of distant birdsong in the air. My mind raced with thoughts of the strange voice, the shadowy figure, and the carvings on the stone. None of it made sense. Back at home, I cleaned the cut on my head and forced myself to calm down. I convinced myself that I had been imagining things, that the fall and the pain had muddled my senses, turned shadows into specters. But as night fell, I found myself avoiding windows, drawing the curtains tight. Even in the safety of my home, that sense of being watched lingered, like a cold breath on the back of my neck. I tried to distract myself with television, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the amphitheater. Despite the terror I'd felt, I couldn't help but feel a strange fascination, like I'd glimpsed the edge of a hidden world. And deep down, I knew that I would return. There was something unfinished there, something that called to me in whispers and shadows. I fell asleep on the couch, clutching the remote like a lifeline, but my dreams were filled with darkness and the sound of scraping footsteps. I awoke in the early hours, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. It took a moment for me to realize that the whispering sound from my dreams hadn't faded. It lingered, coming from somewhere outside my window. With trembling hands, I pulled back the curtain a sliver, peering into the darkness beyond. The backyard was empty, the trees swaying gently in the wind. But there, at the edge of the shadows, I thought I saw a figure, a dark silhouette, standing perfectly still among the trees. Watching, I shut the curtain quickly, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, I stood there in the darkness of my living room, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. But as I listened, I heard it again. Faint, barely more than a breath, but unmistakable. A whisper speaking my name. The whispers stayed with me. They followed me through each restless night, filling the silence with soft, indistinct murmurs that made my skin crawl. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the window became suspect, as if the darkness itself had come alive and was pressing against the walls, trying to seep inside. I tried to ignore it, to push the memories of the amphitheater out of my mind, but it felt as if something had changed in the world around me. Something subtle and malevolent. After several nights of unease, I realized that ignoring it wasn't working. The more I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, the stronger the pull became. A nagging itch at the back of my mind, urging me to return to the amphitheater. It was as if I had left something behind that needed to be retrieved, or perhaps something that had found me wasn't finished yet. By the fifth night, I couldn't stand it anymore. I made a decision that filled me with a cold, resigned dread. I had to go back, not because I wanted to, but because the whispers left me no other choice. I told myself that if I faced whatever it was, maybe the nightmares and the feeling of being watched would end. So, with a flashlight and a backpack, I set out into the forest once again, the night swallowing me as soon as I left the safety of the streetlights behind. The forest seemed different under the cover of darkness. Deeper, more labyrinthine, as if the paths had shifted in my absence. My flashlight cut through the shadows, but the beam felt weak, barely illuminating the twisted shapes of branches and roots. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a dark silhouette slipping between the trees. My breath came in short, ragged bursts, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into a trap. Took what felt like an eternity to find the clearing again. When I finally pushed through the last of the undergrowth, the amphitheater loomed before me, its stone steps bathed in the pale glow of the moon. The place was utterly still, the air thick with a strange tension that prickled my skin. I felt like an intruder in a forbidden place, one that wasn't meant to be visited under the night sky. I hesitated at the edge of the steps, my flashlight casting long, jittery shadows across the stone. But the pull was stronger than my fear, and I found myself descending the steps once more, each footfall echoing hollowly in the still air. The carvings on the stage seemed to shimmer under the moonlight, their patterns twisting into shapes that my mind couldn't quite grasp. I stopped at the center of the stage, the spot where I'd felt the vibrations before. The air was colder here, and I could see my breath misting in front of me, even though it was summer. The carvings seemed to pulse with a faint light, as if the stone itself was breathing. I knelt down, pressing my hand to the center of the spiral again, half expecting the same strange hum from before. But this time, the stone beneath my palm felt warm, almost hot, and the carvings seemed to shift under my touch, like something beneath the surface was stirring. My breath hitched as I felt the ground beneath me give a faint tremor, like the heartbeat of some immense, slumbering creature. The whispers returned, clearer now, resolving into a voice that slithered through my mind. The words were in that same unknowable language, but somehow I understood their intent. Welcome, welcome home. I jerked my hand away, but the warmth lingered, spreading up my arm and into my chest like a fever. Panic clawed at my throat, and I tried to stand, but a sharp pain shot through my leg. Roots had twisted around my ankle, snaking up from the cracks in the stone. I yanked my leg free, stumbling back, but the roots seemed alive, writhing towards me like fingers seeking a grip. I turned and fled, stumbling up the steps as the ground seemed to pulse beneath me, sending tremors through my feet. As I reached the top of the amphitheater, I glanced back and nearly choked on a scream. The stage was moving. The carvings writhed like living things, shifting and twisting, the spiral opening into a dark chasm at the center of the stone. From that chasm, shadows spilled forth, dark, amorphous figures that swirled like smoke, their shapes indistinct but filled with a terrible, unnatural fluidity. They slithered across the stone, rising into humanoid forms with elongated limbs and faceless heads. Their presence felt like an open wound in reality, a gap through which something wrong was seeping into the world. The shadows reached towards me, their forms stretching and twisting as if struggling to maintain shape. I ran, my heart pounding in my ears, the whispers growing louder until they filled my mind with their dissonant chorus. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the clearing, crashing through the underbrush and away from that cursed place. I reached my house just as dawn began to break, the first pale light of morning staining the sky. I stumbled inside, locking the door behind me, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. My mind raced, trying to process what I had seen, but the memories slipped through my thoughts like oil, leaving only a lingering sense of dread. I spent the entire day in a haze, the shadows from the amphitheater playing over and over in my mind. I tried to tell myself that it wasn't real, that it had been some kind of waking nightmare, but deep down I knew the truth. I had opened something in that place, something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. As evening fell, I realized with a growing sense of horror that the whispers had returned. But now they weren't confined to my mind. They echoed from the corners of my home, slipping through the walls and from beneath the floorboards. I could hear them even when I covered my ears, a low, insistent murmur that set my teeth on edge. Desperation clawed at me, and I grabbed my phone, trying to find any information about the amphitheater. Anything that could tell me what I had awakened. But every search came up empty. It was as if the place didn't exist, as if it had been erased from every map and record. Yet I knew it was real. I could still feel the warmth of the stone against my palm, the weight of those shadowy figures' gaze. And then, as I scrolled through the blank search results, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The screen of my phone was flickering, the text warping and twisting, and between the lines of unreadable code, a single word emerged, written over and over again. Welcome. I dropped the phone, my pulse racing, as the whispering swelled into a cacophony that filled the house. The lights flickered and dimmed, plunging the room into a half-darkness that seemed to crawl with movement. I backed away, my mind teetering on the edge of panic, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows stretched across the floor, lengthening into twisted shapes that slithered towards me. In the dim glow of the fading light, I saw a shape, tall and thin, standing in the doorway to my living room. Its head tilted, like it was listening, and I realized with a jolt of terror that it was the same figure I had seen at the amphitheater. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to force myself to breathe, but all I could think of was the way the shadows had moved, the way they had reached for me. The figure shifted closer, its limbs moving in strange, stuttering motions that made my stomach churn. It reached out one elongated hand, and I felt the air grow cold, the shadows pooling around its feet. The whispers rose to a fever pitch, and through the haze of terror, I realized what they were saying now, the meaning crystallizing in my mind. You are ours. The figure stood motionless in the doorway, its silhouette bending and shifting as if it struggled to maintain a solid form. The air in the room grew colder with each passing second, the temperature plummeting until my breath came out in shaky, visible puffs. The whispers had swelled into a chaotic chorus, 1,000 voices speaking at once, each word curling around my mind like tendrils, pulling me deeper into a whirlpool of fear. I tried to move, to run, but my legs felt like they were trapped in quicksand. Every inch of my body ached with a cold that seeped into my bones, making my thoughts sluggish, my heartbeat irregular. The figure's head twitched, the movement sharp and unnatural, and I felt its gaze sweep over me. Although it had no eyes, I knew it was watching, measuring, waiting for something. Desperation surged through me, cutting through the numbness. I forced myself to look away from the figure, tearing my eyes from its twisting form. My gaze fell on the flashlight I had left on the kitchen counter, its beam casting a faint cone of light across the floor. With a burst of energy, I lunged for it, my fingers scrabbling against the smooth surface before I finally managed to grab hold of it. As soon as my hand closed around the flashlight, the figure in the doorway surged forward, its shape blurring like ink spilled in water. A jagged sound, like the grinding of stone against stone, filled the room as the shadows swirled around its outstretched arms. I swung the flashlight towards it, turning the beam on full strength. The light sliced through the darkness, striking the figure directly. For a split second, the shadows peeled back, revealing something more solid beneath. A withered, gaunt shape, its limbs impossibly thin, its face a twisted mask of hollow features that seemed to stretch and warp in the light. A piercing shriek tore through the air, the sound so loud it felt like needles driving into my skull. I stumbled backward, covering my ears, but the figure recoiled from the light, its form spasming as if caught in a strong wind. For a moment, I thought I had a chance to escape, but then, just as quickly, the shadows closed back around it, thickening into a solid mass that seemed to drink in the light. The beam of the flashlight dimmed, flickering wildly as if the darkness was leeching away its power. My heart sank as the figure straightened, its mouth twisting into a smile that stretched far too wide, revealing rows of needle-like teeth that glittered in the faint light. It was toying with me. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just a mindless shadow. It was aware, intelligent, and it had drawn me back to the amphitheater, into its territory, for a reason. The realization hit me like a blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. I staggered back, the flashlight slipping from my hands and clattering to the floor, its beam rolling across the walls before finally coming to rest, pointing into the far corner of the room. The figure stepped forward, slow and deliberate, savoring each step as if it was enjoying the fear that radiated from me. I knew then that I couldn't face it here, in this confined space. There was only one thing left to do. I turned and bolted for the door, bursting out into the night, my feet pounding against the ground as I fled towards the forest. Branches tore at my face and arms as I plunged into the woods, the underbrush closing in around me. The whispers followed, threading through the trees like a living thing, twisting around my thoughts and filling my mind with half-formed images of darkness and death. But I couldn't stop. My only thought was to reach the amphitheater, to find some way to close whatever door I had opened. The forest seemed endless, the path warping and shifting beneath my feet, leading me deeper into shadows. My lungs burned, and my legs screamed in protest, but I forced myself to keep going. I could hear something moving behind me, a low, rasping breath that matched the rhythm of my own. The figure was following, but it never ran. Its footsteps were slow, measured, as if it knew that no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape it. When I finally broke through the underbrush into the clearing, I nearly collapsed from relief. The amphitheater lay before me, bathed in pale moonlight, its stone steps glowing like the bones of some ancient, buried creature. But now, in the dead of night, it looked even more alien, the carvings on the stage writhing like serpents under the silver light. I staggered down the steps, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and approached the center of the stage where the spiral marking lay. The air buzzed with an electric tension, the shadows at the edge of the clearing thickening like a gathering storm. I could feel the figure watching from somewhere behind me, a dark presence that pressed against my back like a physical weight. I knelt down, pressing my palms against the center of the spiral, feeling the heat surge up through the stone once more. The whispers rose to a crescendo, a maelstrom of voices that filled my skull with their maddening chant. My vision blurred, but I forced myself to focus on the shapes beneath my hands, tracing the grooves with trembling fingers, trying to find some pattern, some way to undo what I had done. The ground beneath me shuddered, and I heard a deep, rumbling groan as if the earth itself was in pain. A crack appeared in the center of the stage, spreading outward like a spiderweb, the spiral splitting open to reveal a darkness that went on forever. From that chasm, a wind howled up, carrying with it a stench like rotting leaves and old, stagnant water. The figure emerged from the shadows, stepping onto the stage behind me. I could feel it looming over me, its breath cold against the back of my neck. The whispers became a single, unified voice, whispering words I could almost understand, promises of an end, of a darkness that would embrace me and consume all that I was. With a surge of defiance, I shoved my hands deeper into the crack, feeling the rough edges scrape against my skin. The warmth beneath the stone turned to searing heat, burning my palms, but I held on, gritting my teeth against the pain. The wind from the chasm roared louder, and I sensed the shadows swirling around us, drawn into the opening like water down a drain. The figure hissed, a sound like steam escaping from a boiling kettle. Its hands closed around my shoulders, bony fingers digging into my flesh, but I didn't let go. I poured every ounce of my will into that crack, forcing it wider, feeling the darkness beneath rise up to meet me. For a brief, horrible moment, I thought it would pull me in two, that I would fall into that endless void with the shadows. But then, with a sound like a thunderclap, the crack slammed shut, and the chasm beneath the stage vanished. The air stilled, and the oppressive weight of the shadows lifted. The figure released its grip on my shoulders, stumbling back as the shadows around it dissipated into thin air. It wavered, its form flickering like a dying flame, before collapsing into a heap of ash that scattered across the stone. Silence fell over the amphitheater, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. I collapsed onto the stage, clutching my burned hands to my chest, feeling the warmth of the stone fade beneath me. The carvings were still, their shapes dull and lifeless. Whatever power had resided there was gone, sealed away in that final act. As I lay there, staring up at the night sky, I felt a strange emptiness settle into my chest, a void where the whispers had once been. But it was a welcome emptiness, a silence that spoke of peace rather than fear. The figures in my nightmares had been real, and the darkness they served had nearly consumed me, but I had closed the door. I left the amphitheater at dawn, the forest quiet around me, the trees no longer whispering secrets. When I emerged from the woods, the world seemed brighter, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. But even as I returned home, I knew that the memory of that place would never fully leave me. The amphitheater was still there, buried in the forest, waiting for the next unwary soul to stumble upon it. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when the wind blows through the trees just right, I think I hear faint whispers on the breeze, a reminder that some doors, once opened, never truly close.